I wanted to go through Clarke's technical studies because I know with Clarke's, it's a book that was studying with Claude and it's my own practice and other people's practice that everyone uses, and it's a really significant book. I know that I think just about any trumpet player that's in the world that has decent technique has worked on this book and works on it a lot. I know that the people that I admire a lot, like Doc Severinsen or Alan Vizzuti or Arturo Sandoval or Harry, of course, and everyone else, they all work out of this book. Out of the 10 years that I took from Claude Gordon, I would say at least 6 months out of every year was spent in that book, probably more. And I never felt like that I was done with the book. By contrast, there's a friend of, like, I see Larry Miller here, and there's a friend of mine that Rich Hoffman, that started lessons with Claude about the same time, and he told me a story about a teacher that he had before that said, "Okay, we did the Clarke's book, we're done with it," and we were talking about how funny it was that now that we were taken from Claude, that we felt like we're never done with this book, and there's always things that you can pull out of it. And what I was hoping to do with this today is kind of give you some guidelines and principles, and with the little article that I put with the registration booklet, to give you some things to add into your own practice to get even more out of the book. So what I'd encourage you to do is, out of the booklet, it might be a little bit confusing, but I listed off every single exercise, and you'll see things like number 23, M1, beat 3, this fingering, so that you could go through every single exercise right in these fingerings. The reason why is because you'll find about maybe like 2/3 of those fingerings are listed in Claude's systematic approach book, and there are other ones that didn't get put in the book, so I was hoping to fill in what's there. And then what you'll find is, after you practice these a certain period of time, you're going to feel like the thought process of it carries over into music that you're playing, and then eventually into other etude books, and you'll kind of get some of that. So when we're working on Clarke's technical studies, it applies to the idea of fingers, and kind of several things fit together, like I was talking about yesterday: fingers and the grip of your hand. So with fingers, the main thing to think about is striking your valves hard and lifting your fingers high. And this is another one of those things that when people practice, they kind of downplay, and they don't do as much as they should. And it's there. I played a clip last year that was interesting. I've got all these sound files of Claude's brass camps that I put up on my website, and when I was listening to some of them, his introduction on the first one, he tells a story. uh, Actually, Larry is on this, where Larry introduces him, and the first thing that Claude talks about is how there was a man that was older, that had played for about 40 years, came to take lessons with him, and after several months of working on the Clarke's technical studies, he was saying, this isn't working for me. I'm just not improving, and my technique's not going anywhere. I don't think it's going to work for me. And Claude said, well, you're practicing the same way that you did for the past 40 years. And the guy wasn't lifting his fingers up and striking his valves hard. And it's such a big deal because if you don't do that, you're only going to go so far with developing your fingers. But if you really exaggerate this, it helps it out. So like, for example, when you're doing it, you want to try to exaggerate the movement a lot. Now what happens is, when you're playing faster, like in your practice, your fingers might be doing this. Like, say if you're doing like Clarke's 4, which were, like this one, you want to exaggerate it like that, and then when you're going faster, your finger might actually not go quite as high as it did previously, but by training it to exaggerate it, it's going to make it to where it stays cleaner and all that. So that's why that's a big deal. Now, there's some quotes about this, because Claude and Herbert Clarke weren't the only people to do this. But this is a quote that comes from the Top Tones book. How many of you have the Walter Smith Top Tones book? Cool. Now, Top Tones is this etude book that's a little bit more advanced. It's got 30 etudes in it. It goes through major keys with all the way up to 7 sharps, 7 flats, and it goes through the minor keys with all the way up to 7 sharps, 7 flats. And it's got some really interesting things in it, and he's got little comments along the way. So this is what he says: form the habit of striking the valves hard, and this study will improve your finger technique. And here's another quote that's in Alan Vizuti's method book. It's volume 1. He's got like a 3-volume set. And he says, bang the valves down firmly. And Alan Vizzuti was kind of like a protege of Doc Severinsen. And this is a page that someone had given me that came from a clinic handout. And I happened upon it. And this is Doc Severinsen's writing that he wrote and handed out to someone. You can see down on the bottom where he says, bang the valves down hard. He was telling someone about what they should practice and how. Now, the next set of pictures, when I think about this, they're in the Clarke Gordon books. There wasn't really any specific pictures about how to hold your trumpet and fingers, but I think Larry would probably agree with me that the pictures I'm going to show you, these would be what he taught me, at least, with how to hold the horn and how to position my hand. This, I'd say, is correct. You can see where notice how the thumb is straight and where the fingers are, where it's not like using the very tip of the fingers, but kind of like the ball of the fingers. And here's another angle where you can see how the grip of the left hand is pretty stable there, and then the fingers, how high they're lifting up off the valves. Here's another one. And here's some things that people get into that's not correct. And I'll tell you kind of what's wrong with this. Like, you see how I'm using the tips of my fingers, and also notice how if my thumb is bending, like is in the picture, it cramps my hand up to where now my fingers are in a less comfortable position. They're not able to move as freely. So what I'd say about that is people make 2 errors. Either their hands are too cramped up and tense like that, or if they get them flat like this, you don't have as much leverage with your fingers, and they can't really strike the valves down as clean. So there's another shot of the correct thing. Now the grip of your left hand is actually a bigger deal than most people think, because if you're not holding it right, your horn will jiggle around when you're striking the valves, and it'll sound kind of different because of that. And the other thing is, like, you want your wrist to be able to be flexible to move. Even though Claude didn't get into talking about, some people talk about pivoting and all that kind of stuff, he actually downplayed that quite a bit, because everyone kind of does a little bit different thing with that. But the tongue level and the air, if they're working right, and if you're holding the horn right, those things will just kind of adjust and go the way they're supposed to go. But that's why the grip is such a crucial thing. So with that, this would be what I'd say is correct, where the horn is kind of resting in your hand flat. Where what I'm feeling when I'm grabbing hold of the horn is that the valve casing is actually sitting in the palm of my hand. So it feels like it's just touching right there, and it's real stable, and I'm not having to be really tense with it. And so that's like a picture of that. Then this is, I put, of course, like MF, like Maynard Ferguson. I see people do this, and Maynard's actually one of my favorite trumpet players. And tell a story about this is the way I ended up going to Clarke Gordon for lessons was because I heard Maynard Ferguson play for the first time when I was a freshman in high school. There was a jazz festival they used to have every Memorial Day at Disneyland, and my high school went to this. Our concert band played during the day, and then they had this 3-day jazz festival, and Maynard was there, and Dizzy Gillespie, and I think Toshiko Akiyoshi and her big band, and there's a lot of cool musicians. But I went to hear Maynard play, and I'd never really heard anyone play high notes at that point, and it kind of made me feel like, wow, I can't play the trumpet, because every single one of the 5 guys in the trumpet section were playing double C's and playing all this crazy stuff, and Maynard was playing. And I went home and I said, I want to be able to do that, and I couldn't do it. So I started looking around, and I found on the back of one of the Arben's books, it mentioned Clarke Gordon. It had Stan Mark and Maynard Ferguson's name on there, and Maynard was saying how some of his trumpet players in his section had taken from Claude. So I had seen a poster before with several people on it. I think Larry was on that, and several other guys like Paul Witt and Tom Brazine and Kent McCassa. All these guys were there at the brass camp, and so I thought this would probably be a good thing to go to. But I waited like another year or so. So then once I showed up and got lessons with Claude, my whole mentality for taking lessons was just so I could play high notes. I had bad finger technique, and it was like the weakest thing in my playing. The teacher that I had before was telling me that I was bad at it, but he never gave me specifics about how to work on it. Now, when I started my first lessons with Claude, the first thing he had me doing was playing Clarke's technical studies and things like that in all 12 keys. And I never really had done that. So it was kind of interesting that within about 3 weeks, I knew my major scales. And I'd never been able to do that before. And then it was more than that because he wanted me to have the correct finger technique and everything that really started taking it beyond just knowing the scales. So back to about Maynard. So if someone asked Claude about this, his reaction was, well, hold the horn the way I tell you, but until you play like Maynard, then you can hold the horn the way you want to if you play like Maynard. So that's why that was there. And then here's what's the next one. The horn is kind of rotated, and the reason why this wouldn't be such a great thing. Someone was just asking me about this. I think it was last night or this morning. If your horn, like if I'm holding it like what I'm saying is correct, and you rotate the horn to the side, what it does is it makes your fingers go into that kind of tighten up position that's not so good. So that's why that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, I guess if you did that and put your hand down like that, you could still get your hand in position, but I think it'd probably make everything else kind of cramped up too. So here's a picture of what I believe is the correct grip and finger technique. Now on to Clarke's technical studies and some of the fingering stuff here. Is Sergio Frede here? No. I was going to show you something that I can just do it myself. I put a diagram up there. There's a thing that Claude would have everyone do for the etudes in the Clarke's technical studies. He'd call how you practice. And what he would use this for is that you practice in such a way that you'd eliminate the possibility of making a mistake. And so the way this works, I made this diagram so you could see kind of different steps to it. And I put like step 1, step 2. So if you look at like right there where it says step 1, that's day number 1. And then you've got you'll play each of these 4 times in a row perfectly. So I would get up there and I'd play the low G. I haven't really played a whole lot this morning, but I played the low G. And I would say I didn't get a good attack on that note. So I wouldn't count that as a good note. So let me try it again. Yeah, do it again. I'd take it off my mouth and then do it again. So I'd count that as 2, 3, and then. Now, if I messed up anywhere along the way, I would redo it until I got 4 perfect ones in a row. And then I would go to the previous beat. And notice that there's third valve on and I'll talk about the alternate fingerings. You'll use those, there's like third valve on the E and the A. So it's like. Also, we do this thing in Clarke's where you'd start off a week of doing it single-tongued, doing it this way. So I'm intentionally single-tonguing, not slurring like it's written in the book. So I'd do that again. You notice how I'm trying to strike my valves and exaggerate them. And I would do that till I get 4 times in a row perfectly. Then I back up to where it says step 3, which is right there, when I'm playing that one beat up to the first note of the next beat. That's why I kind of drew that diagram. And then I'll do that 4 times in a row perfectly. Then I go from there, see where it says step 4, from there to the end 4 times in a row perfectly. And what I'm doing is just adding backwards through the whole thing till I can play the whole thing through. Let me see. Now, the thing about doing this is you do it enough times and it's like you can't help but memorize the thing and hopefully not miss any notes in it. And like, I haven't even done this in a long time. I haven't been playing Clarke's too, but I bet you I can like memorize or play it from memory. I'll do it single tongued. Let's look at it. I probably should have taken a bigger breath. But so your goal with this is to make it to where you train this into your fingers and to where you know it so well that you can't miss. One of the things that there's a guy that Harry knows that I used to play Latin man gigs with named Lou Gonzalez. And I remember Lou and I were playing, and he's about the age of Harry, and he was telling me that when he was taken with Claude impressed upon him that the difference between some people just practicing to the point to where they don't make a mistake, where Claude stressing the point that like someone that wants to be a virtuoso or really a master at the instrument would practice so you can't make a mistake. Because when you do this is one of the things that kind of eliminates fear too, is that if you practice that way, you look at anyone like Harry or Arturo or any great trumpet players or brass players, they're not up there worrying about, well, what happens if I can't do this? They practice in such a way that they know that they're not going to make a mistake. And if it happens, they don't worry about it. But it's because you played in such a way you train everything to work just without a doubt all the time. Now with alternate fingerings, there's some principles that kind of apply. This is the first page out of Clarke's Technical Studies number 2. And you can see there's some alternate fingerings on the page. And this is listed in the article I gave you. Like, see, there's some here like in the key of B. You've got the first E is third bow, but then the second E is 1 and 2. And then up here, on the key of A and the key of E, I'm going to explain that. Like the key of A, I remember the first time I did this, and every time I've given this to students, they hate it because they're like, man, this is like so aggravating. It sounds terrible and it feels so weird. But with doing these, what I believe it's doing is it's helping you to be able to get better control of your fingers by like kind of isolating them to where your third finger can work more independent of the others, because we don't use it as much. A lot of times when we're playing, we're using just the first 2, but by doing exercises like this, you train your third finger to work a lot better so that it's got more control. Now, I'm not a piano player, but I've seen other piano players work on finger technique things where they're trying to be able to control all their fingers really well. It's kind of the same thing with us. And so there's a couple reasons behind the alternate fingerings. Some of them are going to be harder than normal, and they're kind of helping develop your independent control of your fingers. And some of them are going to be easier than the normal fingerings. And then what happens is when you're in a playing situation, the more you practice these fingerings in your Clarke's Technical Studies, it'll kind of be instinctual to where you're going to do the ones that are going to work. Because in a performance, all that matters is going to sound good. No one's going to care if you're using an alternate fingering or not, just as long as it's clean and sounds good. So this is one of the ones where it would kind of force you to, it's a harder one. It would make you have to get better control of your third finger. And then on this one, this is down the page in the key of E and D. And this is kind of a different way of writing it down than I will probably put on your sheet. Claude would explain it this way, like he would have people, he would first write in the one that's in the key of E, and all the E's and the A's are a third valve. But then what he'd put hand right in there, hold first down continually and use these fingerings. So you'd hold first valve down. You notice this one, you never move your first valve. So if your first valve moves on lesson 36 or exercise 36, you know you've done the fingering the wrong way. So then in order to get lesson 34, you're just pressing down your first valve and it's lowering you a whole step. But what in effect you're doing is you're fingering the F sharps with 1, 2, and 3 and the G's with 1 and 3. So it makes it to where you're doing this like the first or key of E would be like this. And then the same idea with D, but just with the first valve down. So that'll develop your fingers with that. Now, there are other ones that are in lesson 2, but I was going to skip ahead to lesson 3, where it knows how it's got arpeggios. Some of the things that happen would be kind of obvious for you to figure out, but like for example here with the D, D, G, and B, you're fingering 1 and 3, so it's kind of like a bugled sort of thing. And then there's some other ones that are going to be on your list that are a little bit different. Now in Clarke's 4, some of these, like you look on number 67, for the exercise, you're actually fingering 1 and 2 for that, but if for the trill, but if I were in a performance situation, I probably wouldn't do that. But for the exercise, I would. So like here would be the alt or the real fingering. But if I were in a performance situation, I would use an alternate fingering. Because that works better. But notice how he carries on that idea even onto the next page, where on number 69 right there, he's having you do the A's with third valve. So that intentionally makes it harder. Clarke 6, you notice how he's having you do third valve for the A's. This is one on this measure here. I think this is much easier than doing the regular fingering. So if you're doing it with these fingerings up here, it's like regular fingerings be like this. But with the alternate fingering, it's a lot easier with the alternate fingering. So that's an instance where when you're practicing this alternate fingering, it'll help you in a performance situation where if you have a pattern like that, it'll probably just automatically start to happen. Now going back to Clarke's 8, this is kind of a weird thing that I'd never seen until I was taking lessons with him. He'd have you do alternate fingerings, even to the point to where you can see up around here on the C natural. He's having you do 2 and 3 for the C natural. And also notice it's hard to read, but right there's like a 1 and a 2 for like the E natural, but right before it, like this E natural right here and that E natural, you're doing open. Because with this pattern actually ends up being an easier thing to do in the future too. So I'll just play it a little bit slow like the beginning with the alternates. So that ends up being an easier way to finger that. And where it also, I remember getting applied to other things is when we went on to the Clarke's technical studies or Clarke's characteristic studies book, maybe a couple years after doing this, he even worked some of the alternate fingerings into the Clarke's technical studies book. But I took from him up until I think 1993 or 94, and he passed away in 1996. And we'd gone through probably the first half of Clarke's characteristic studies, and I wasn't good enough to actually finish the whole thing at the time. I think I was like a college student, and he'd taken me into another etude book. But I wanted to do the rest of the book, so I picked it up on my own and started working through it step by step. And some of the alternate fingerings were in there. So the cool thing was, because since I had worked on these alternate fingerings out of the Clarke's technical studies book, I could look at the characteristic studies book and say, hey, it makes sense to do these alternate fingerings here because it kind of follows the patterns that I'd done before. So it was really a really useful thing, and it all comes from the Clarke's technical studies book. That's the end of what I was going to say. Now I was going to ask if anyone had any questions about any of this. I've got it. Okay, go ahead.
I think it was yesterday you demonstrated a chromatic scale that you did very softly over a number of octaves. I know it's not exactly Clarke, but it is.
Yeah, it is Clarke. There's like Clarke's one. You're probably talking about the.
Talking about the 4 octave.
Yeah, like the 3-octave chromatic thing, or just the really soft.
Today.
What's that?
I was just saying it wasn't what you were talking about today.
Oh yeah, well that would be in Clarke's 9. Clarke's 9 is. I remember when I first went through the book, kind of in going through Clarke's technical studies, Claude had a. Not that he didn't always do this with every single person, but he would usually start people with study 1 and do 1 week of single tongue, then a second week with K tongue, then a third week with double tongue, then the 4th week with slurred. And they do the same thing all the way through the book. When a person like myself got up to lesson 8, we'd stop and go back through the book and start working on it again. Some people, if they could have played higher, he might have gone on to study 9. In study 9, it's got chromatics, like the first one's like from a low F sharp to a high D, where it does like this. And it says to do it 4 times in one breath. For myself, I remember when I went through that book, I got it to where maybe a D or an E flat, and it was working. And then what was a weird thing that happened is if I tried to go to the next one, like an E, I'd get to 1 time in one breath, and I'd try the second time in one breath, the notes would just totally shut off. And I was like, oh man, I could play higher in my range study. What's happening that I can't just play this chromatic? And what occurred to me later, and I kind of see that there was a process in it with, he had me on certain flexibility studies. Like I remember there was a change that happened in my playing where he kept me on the Charles Cullen Advanced Lip Flexibilities book for about 9 months. And I was on the same exercises, and I was like, okay, I'm getting kind of bored with these. And I thought, man, I can play these things. These aren't a big deal, and I want to do something different. Well, then I remember I was in my practice room, and I remember exactly when it happened. I was playing some stuff, and I had this feeling like, wow, high D. It was on Clarke. It was on. Does anyone know the Colon Advanced Lip Flexibilities book? How many of you have that book? So what happened was it was on exercise 9, and where it does this sort of thing, like. And I got up to the high D, and I thought, this high D doesn't feel any different than like a low C. And I'd heard people say like, yeah, your high C could be as easy as low C. And I was like, it does feel kind of like nothing's happening. It's so much easier. And I was like, this is kind of cool. And then I went to try to play like an E, and I went back to kind of tightening up, and it didn't work. But then at that point, I remember my playing just started getting more relaxed. And then some of the breath control stuff where the notes were cutting off stopped happening. And I think it was, what it shows is kind of the aspects of working on the flexibility studies started affecting the other parts of my playing. And that's where if I wouldn't have followed the directions and done the flexibility exercises, I wouldn't have seen the benefit in the Clarke's technical studies. So that's where I think things all kind of go together with how you put the routine together. So that's but that's a big deal. And then and what I talked about with the soft playing, I remember a thing that went through a process in my playing where Larry will probably remember Brad Kincher. Brad Kincher is this great studio horn player, and I used to share a house with him when I was in college, and I heard him in the room next door practicing Clarke's technical studies, and he would do maybe like 20 times in one breath or something like that on one of the things. And I remember this other friend of mine, Rich Hoffman, did like 50 or 55 times in one breath. And I was in my room trying to play faster and faster, and it was sloppy, and I couldn't get it to get to as many times in one breath. And I was just thinking I was just gonna press on through it. And I remember Brad saying, "What are you doing? It doesn't sound good." And I was thinking, "Oh, I can do this." It's I like being all like kind of cocky about it. And I remember when he said that, I was like, I'm just kind of stuck on doing this the same way. Am I gonna like change what I'm doing with my practice or just keep playing it the same old way? So I said, he's right. So I slowed it down, started playing it cleaner and not worrying about how many times I was doing one breath. And then slowly some things fell into place better with my fingers and some other things. And then after several more months, I could actually do a lot more repetitions in one breath. But I think some of it is like realizing that whether it's Clarke's technical studies or something else, that you've got to kind of realize where you are and not try to think that you have to be playing as good as someone else. I know that in my own playing that has happened before, where if I don't, like, I always try to think of it as like my goal is to kind of get a little bit better every day depending on how I personally play. So like say for example I get up to a high a high G or something like that, and the G sharp is like kind of where it's starting to change. My goal is to try to get that G sharp as best as I can. Of course, try to go higher on the range study and do stuff like that, but I'm not worrying about, well, what if this guy next to me can play like a F above double C? I gotta like force that out. That's kind of not me. So I just kind of, it's like I think of it as like I'm competing with myself in my own daily practice instead of competing with someone else. And what's good about that is I think that you have to think like that in order to be excellent at something, because if you're just thinking that you have to be better than someone else, then what would happen if you were like the best trumpet player in the world, and or say if you're like Alan Vizzuti and you thought, well, I can do this thing that no one else does, I don't need to do anymore. I mean, someone like that wouldn't think like that. So you got to think about like, well, okay, I can do this. So let me see if I can do a little bit better than what I did before. And that then the standard is excellence and striving to be excellent instead of just trying to be better than someone else that you know or something like that. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Jeff, when you're working up the etudes for speed, how often are you going to go back and start at the bottom and work back to the top? Do you do that with every click of the metronome, or just once at the beginning?
No, I do it once at the beginning, and then like on the etudes I have Clarke's technical studies, once at the beginning, nail it down really well. And with myself, I've probably gone back through doing that with Clarke's technical studies and Clarke's characteristic studies about 3 times. Then if I feel that I'm really missing something and I really want to drill it back into myself, I'll go back and do it again. Like about a year or two ago, I went through the entire Clarke's characteristic studies book. And this wouldn't be for everyone, but I really wanted to get better at it. So I started with Clarke's characteristic studies #1. I did the last 2 lines with this a day, with this how you practice thing, then the next 2 lines. And after, I think there are 14 lines on the page. So after about 14 lines, I'm done with it. So in 7 days, I'd work through the how you practice. And then I knew that Clarke's characteristic studies, number one, I'd really worked through the striking of the valves and drilled it into myself. And I knew that I had it. Then I took my metronome, and the next day after that, I'd set it at a speed that I could play it really good. And I'd play it through, and I'd try to make it where I didn't nick a note or anything like that. And then I'd try it again, and so I could get 4 perfect times in a row. And then if I knew that I got it on that day, then the next day I would turn it up 1 click faster and try it again. And then after, I think I spent like a month. I mean, I wanted to make sure that I just took my time. So I'd spend a month on number one. And then what I did is I went on to Clarke's characteristic studies number two, did the same thing. And then I'd go back through and just play characteristic studies number one time, but I tried to make sure that I wouldn't miss at all. Well, I'd been doing it previous month, so it was kind of easy. And what I did over the course of several months is I started adding each one. So like the third month, I was playing Clarke 1 and 2 and working on number 3. So after about 2 years, and it was kind of a real drawn out process, I could play all 24 etudes in a row. But what was kind of cool is like I had them memorized almost, and I'd just like be on autopilot playing through this, and it really helped out what I was doing. So, I mean, not everyone would want to do that much on it, and it probably wouldn't be the thing for everyone, but just something I did. Any other questions? Go ahead.
On how you practice, so you start at the end of the piece and you work your way back. One you do that. When you reach the beginning of the A2 or whatever it is you're working on, do you continue to practice the entire thing? Like let's say, like you said, 4 times before you had it perfectly. Would you advocate doing that, or?
Yeah, maybe I'll explain this a little bit better on this diagram thing. So what happens is like after I've done like, so this is day 1, I'm doing 1 line a day. Then I get to the second day, and I do the same idea working back. And by the 4th day, I'm all the way back here. So after I've completed that, the 4th day I've done all my work. And then after that, I just go through it the next day 4 times in a row perfectly. So my goal is, like, if you were here last year, Susan Slaughter was talking about her mentality is that if she's playing something, she wants to be able to play it 3 times in a row perfectly, and then she tells herself, and I just have one more time to play it. Or so she said this thing last year where if she's put on the spot in an orchestra and the conductor's making her play something hard over and over again, and she's not missed it, and she's thinking, well, I've got to do it again. She says, well, I can play it 3 times in a row perfectly. I just have one more time to do. So it's kind of like saying, I can do this. I just got to do it again. Go ahead.
I actually witnessed something like that back when I was at the New England Conservatory. Every trumpet player in Boston was 6. So they had to hire me, the 6th trumpet, for one spot in Romeo and Juliet. And Leinsdorf was bored. He was the conductor at that time. So we had Vitala, Combe, Voisin, and Gobin, and then me and some other guy. And he took that passage, I don't know if you're familiar with it, that goes da 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 dee da 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 dee da da. That's all trumpets. Bom 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 B flat B flat ba ba ba. And he must have done it 10 times, 8 to 10 times, and it was beautiful. I couldn't hear anything, and those players sat there in Symphony Hall and did not 4 times, but 10 times.
Yeah.
And it was like, why is he doing that? I mean, I was so glad I wasn't playing, but I actually witnessed a professional situation. And this was these guys' careers here. And I just looked at him after and I went, oh my God, do I have to practice?
Yeah.
But it happens, you're absolutely.
Yeah, and I know that, I mean, Claude told stories about one of his students, named Bob O'Donnell, who was put on the spot with some stuff like that, and they do it over and over again. I've heard about Bud Herseth being put on the spot before. I mean, conductors do that kind of stuff. Maybe they're listening for something in the orchestra. Maybe they're trying to give you a hard time. I think one of the things kind of related to that about being so confident and knowing that you can do this no matter what, it puts you at ease because I mean, you take someone like, any of the people that are in the Boston Symphony and like your dad or Herseth or any of these great players, like you'll hear Harry tonight, someone might ask him to do something a whole bunch of times in a row and they're not going to be afraid that they're going to miss it. Last year there was a guy, Sean Hines. He was telling me how he went to a concert one time and heard John Faddis, and someone from, I guess there was a tune, and at the end of it, it had like a high F, and and it kept like vamping on a note, and someone said, they were talking to Faddis, or this guy said, play it again, and he nailed this high F, and I think someone trying to be a smart aleck said, play it 100 times. So I guess he like nailed it 100 times just to kind of show that he could do it. Now, that's kind of crazy, but you know that he's not afraid that he can't do it. And that's kind of where you want your skill to be at that level. So you're just like, I can do that. No big deal, You
know what you do after about the 10th time of that high F is ask them if they want it now or on the concert.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to stop at this point. We're over even a little bit.
I have a question. What is the thinking behind doing it backwards versus forward?
Because people usually start at the beginning of pieces, mess them up, and they never get to the end and play the end as thorough as they play the beginning. So this way, you're kind of playing the end a lot more than you do the beginning.